Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see you guys. Before we get started, I just want to introduce our panel. Next to me is Amy Mitchell. She's the Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center, where she's worked for the last 20 years, helping both journalists and the public better understand news and information. Next to her, Errin Haines, founder and editor-at-large of The 19th, a nonprofit newsroom named for a constitutional amendment, and focusing on the intersection of politics, gender, and policy, and also a contributor to MSNBC. And Robbie Suave, who's with us, he's a writer and senior editor for Reason magazine and author of 2 books, both with great titles, so I have to mention them because they're so good. One is Tech Panic, Why We Shouldn't Fear Facebook and the Future, and then the other one is Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. Such a good combo book.
Taking suggestions for Panic 3.
Panic. And I'm Dafna Linzer. I'm the executive editor of Politico. You all know the topic. It's political identity versus truth. Can the news help? And since this is a pretty savvy panel up here with me, with careers that have been grounded in questioning and poking holes, I should start off by acknowledging that we all took issue with the title of the panel. Our first thing was, is it really political identity versus truth? Right. How are those two things in opposition? Right. And why should the media help? That's another really important question. We're going to grapple with that up here, and we hope you also weigh in as we do so. We'll make sure to leave time at the end for questions, so please think of some good ones. And then let's get to it. Amy, you're the quant up here. You've spent 20 years researching us. How does political identity and truth and journalism even fit together? Does your political identity influence how truthful something is? And do you think there's a desire among the public to even get to the truth?
Well, I think those are all terrific questions, and the last one is really a stumper these days. Luckily, we just very recently released a new report that included both a survey of about 12,000 journalists, which hopefully many of you may have taken, and then also managed to also do a companion survey of the public. It was about 10,000 US adults. And so there are definitely some insights from those that I can kind of kick some things off with. If one of the first questions is around in this sort of threesome, right, of the public, of news, and the news industry and truth, is the relationship and the dynamic between journalists, the news media, and the public itself. And if we look at a few questions in those areas, one of the things we asked about that is really the core of agreeing on truth is agreeing on a set of facts around a particular news story. Can we come to agree on that? And when we ask journalists if they can agree, 75% of journalists actually feel like journalists themselves can agree on the basic facts of a news story that they're reporting on, even if they cover it differently, that they can agree on the basic facts. But they're much more divided, about 50-50, over whether you can produce a story today that the public can largely all say is accurate. And the public themselves is actually even more pessimistic than journalists about that. 62% of the public say it's not possible to produce a news story today that nearly everybody finds accurate. So that's a fairly striking number. And then the public also is far less concerned than journalists about this tendency that we see of politically like-minded people clustering around the same news outlet. So while 75% of journalists say that's a major problem facing the country today, only about 39% of the public feel that way. So they do not see this as a very big concern. Where there is agreement comes in trust, in how much the public trusts in the news media or doesn't. And one of the questions that we asked, so of the public, 42% actually say that they have little or no trust in the news media today. And when we ask journalists how much they think the public trusts them, almost the exact same percent said, 44% said they didn't think the public had little or no trust in them. So journalists get that part, they're on sync in that. Then just real quickly, that next layer of the dynamic is the reporting, is the trying to get to the truth and the facts. And there are a number of really interesting findings out of this report that I think speak to some of the challenges and the conversations that you all inside the industry are having today. And one of those is about this idea of giving equal coverage. And there's been a lot of discussion around that the last few years. And we now have a small majority of journalists saying that not every side should get equal coverage necessarily in an issue. But there's a difference that journalists see between that and reporting out false or made up news. So when you get to that question, about 2/3 of journalists say that it is important to report a false statement or a made-up statement made by a public figure because you need to let the public know about that. And even while they see misinformation and made-up news as a major thing, there's still a lot of concern in the industry about future restrictions on press freedoms and about harassment. So 42% of journalists have faced external harassment in some form over the past year. I will leave it there.
Yeah, those are fascinating and stark, and we're going to get to a few of these, all of us together. Errin, I'm going to throw it to you first, and I'm just thinking about this because the 19th, is all about kind of changing the narrative on gender and politics. With a community of readers that's kind of exploding. If you haven't checked out the 19th, you should. Talk about where did you start? What was journalism missing that led you and your colleagues to seek out this approach? And maybe to Amy's point about the effects of both sidism, how do you guys handle that?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Dafna, for the plug. 19thnews.org. You can get your free daily newsletter with all of our coverage every single day. I encourage you to subscribe. But no, look, just to touch on something that Amy said before I get to that, with an overwhelming number of journalists kind of agreeing that we agree on a shared set of facts, I think that another piece of this in terms of truth and how people maybe be perceiving or interpreting truth is how we prioritize those facts, right? Which facts we are choosing to emphasize, because those are decisions. Those are part of what it means to shape a narrative. And what we believe, the reason that the 19th exists is because we felt like political journalism, the narratives and the approach to political journalism was just not, it was not being done correctly. And part of the reason that we felt that way is because we know that the news and political journalism in particular has been too white and too male for too long, right? And so the only way, well, not the only way, but the fastest way for us to change that, we thought, was really just to start over. And so that is what we did in January of 2020, locked arms with my other co-founders a week before the Iowa caucuses, if we can get in the Wayback Machine for a minute, and started this newsroom. And really the mission, part of the mission of the 19th is to bring in a lot of those voices that were previously unseen and unheard in our democracy, which does help to change narratives. Also by hiring journalists who are not traditionally thought of or not traditionally a part of that political journalism ecosystem, right? As the decision makers, the gatekeepers, but also as the storytellers. And so because of that, you get different kinds of stories. And also starting with the premise that we want to be a home for everybody who cares about the direction of this country, whether they want to live here or not, regardless of what their politics are, if they have no politics at all, right? But if they are interested in the experiment of democracy and where we go from here together as a nation, your perspective is something that is valued at the 19th, and it is something that we want to platform. And a lot of the people that we talk to in our electorate are people who have not felt seen and heard previously.
You guys go out of your way to describe yourselves as independent instead of nonpartisan. What's the difference?
Well, not out of our way, but we did adjust our mission to reflect that. We started out as nonprofit, nonpartisan. After January 6th, that really changed for us because we are not both siding things like people's humanity. Things like equality, things like democracy are not up for debate in a newsroom like ours, and so we don't do that. We don't believe in that. That does not mean that we cannot be a nonpartisan. That does not mean that we cannot be fair, and that does not mean that we do not try to leave behind an honest and accurate record of who and where we are as a country, which is the point of journalism, which is what it is that we're supposed to be trying to do. But platforming things like the big lie, I mean, that's disingenuous, and to your point, pointing out when a public figure is being dishonest as a matter of public record. I mean, that information is already out there, right? But trying to correct that record is something that we do believe is a value in our business.
There's a pillow in my office at Politico that says, if one side says it's raining and the other side says it isn't, your job isn't to quote both sides. It's to open the window and find out what's going on. To that end, Robbie, and jumping off Erin's good point about even the January 6th coverage, you've written so much about social media, reporting on social media, perspective on social media, its impact on issues in journalism. People worry that it's bad out there on those platforms. Is it corroding shared facts, do you think?
Well, we hear a lot about the downsides of social media, and don't get me wrong, they are significant. But we should keep in mind that social media has also been good for some journalism institutions, for alternative journalism to spring up. I think there can be a danger in letting unanimity of thought or produce a kind of manufactured consensus. Possibly we went through a time period of unusual elite consensus making throughout the maybe 90s and the aughts that I think had some upsides in terms of a more harmonious and less politically stratified society, but also produced some bad policies because there was no independent voices to check and challenge them. Social media has made it possible for a lot of alternative voices to flourish, and sometimes those voices are wrong. Sometimes they say things that are bad or dangerous or unhealthy, but sometimes they get important things that mainstream institutions have missed. My sense is that the mainstream media has really come around to hating this, just hating that they can't quite gatekeep what you're allowed to say and express online. And we've seen, I'm almost more worried about the effect journalists are having on social media than the effect social media is having on journalists, because some of the kind of worst examples, I think, of social media, by which I mean Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Google, YouTube, et cetera, closing off conversations that I think it would be healthier for society if they let people still address them. I'm talking about topics relating to COVID, mitigation, et cetera, the origins of COVID. There was a while where you couldn't even discuss that subject on Facebook, both because the administration had urged Facebook to not let you discuss that, and also because people in the media, and that's really who social media companies listen to, they listen to trusted voices in the media, were saying if you let people discuss these things, you are allowing misinformation to spread. A lot of the distrust in social media, from my experience, that a lot of the distrust of what the media has to say that comes from the right in particular is based on a handful of inarguably bad decisions, like the Hunter Biden laptop story, which we now know was a legitimate story, but was censored on Twitter and Facebook, not really because these companies necessarily wanted to do that, but because mainstream voices in the media said, do this now or you will be guilty of spreading lies. And that's at some point, and it's so hard to paint with a broad brush because the media, I'm referring to the media. Well, there's lots of good people in the media. At institutions, there can be people doing good work and people doing bad work. There can be people doing good work one day and then bad work the next day, in my opinion, right? We're painting with a broad brush, but a lot of, I think, too many people in the media, maybe because they have this antagonistic relationship with the new technology platforms, have sort of taken the view that we need to not correct misinformation, but prevent it from anyone ever encountering it online. And I think that is an unhealthy tendency that can choke off conversations that should continue and that can get things wrong, and actually has really eroded trust among a whole half the country who didn't have as much trust in these institutions as the other side did. Now they have no trust. And some of these, not all of them, some of that is because they've been misled, but some of it is self-inflicted wounds on the part of these institutions, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between misinformation and disinformation as well, which I think is probably kind of help foster that sense of kind of distrust. And to your point also, using terms like media, I think here I'm trying to sort of stick to news media, which I think is more relevant to this panel. But Errin, just kind of having heard that, and especially COVID and some other issues, how about when it comes to some of the kind of weightier social issues, I think, facing the electorate right now, guns, abortion rights, things that are going to be kind of more prominent in the coming months for voters?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think that it is important for us to listen to the electorate. I mean, I think the lessons of the last several presidential cycles are that not enough of us as political journalists are on the ground talking to voters and helping people to understand who their friends, who their family, who their neighbors. Like, there have been some pretty rough Thanksgivings for some of y'all over the past several years, right? Because you're getting to know your relatives in a way that you did not know them before. Why is that? And why is it that we as journalists are not attempting to get to know these people better and the issues that are driving them politically, right? Or driving them away from politics. I think that it is incumbent upon us, obviously, yes, to cover elections. I love covering campaigns. I love being out there on the campaign trail and talking to candidates. But what I really love is hearing directly from voters about the issues that they care about, because so often those are not necessarily the issues that we assume, for folks who are based in Washington, that are the issues that are going to be driving any given election cycle. And so, I think we also have to go into those conversations without assumptions about, what somebody's beliefs may or may not be, especially based on their political affiliation, being open to hearing why it is that they have, a particular stance. Part of the distrust is because there are too many people, especially when it comes to mainstream legacy organizations, that feel like we don't respect or value what their perspective is, right? Or we're making assumptions about them, or we're speaking to them in a way that really is a non-starter.
You think there's a language issue here?
I do. I think that there can be language that feels polarizing or divisive to folks in a way that doesn't move the conversation forward, or in a way that doesn't really help you to get at what it is that is motivating somebody politically, or what it is really that is at the that is underlying in that value or that held belief, or how it is that they came to the position that they have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amy, gut check us here. Does the public feel connected to journalism? Do they read a story and recognize themselves in what they're reading?
Yeah, I mean, it was really fascinating part of what we've seen. I mean, overall, that sense of connection we've seen over and over and over again is one of the closest, to use a really bad data term, correlators with trust. So it really connects closely to trust in the news media, to trust in institutions generally, to positive sense of self-satisfaction. Is that sense that I see myself in this, I feel like they understand who I am. Mm-hmm. When we ask about, that said, when we ask about connection between journalists and the public, journalists are about twice as likely to say they feel very connected to their audiences than audiences are to say they feel very connected to their news sources that they turn to most. So there's definitely a disconnect there about connection, and potentially an opportunity there, as we're talking about, in terms of really figuring out how to listen and how to hear, how to understand, and then reflect.
Yeah. Robbie, readers, I'm sure at Reason, are coming for a specific voice, for like a libertarian take on issues of importance to them. There's a perception that that's the only perspective your readers would want. Do you think that's the case? Do you think they're actually shopping around and you're one perspective and they're looking for others? And if that's not the case, is that even a bad thing?
No, I think it's certainly the case. Our readers come to us for a certain perspective, but I think that's true of virtually every media institution. And in fact, this is something that over time, all institutions have gained better tools from an analytics perspective in knowing exactly what their readers and listeners want and like. I think about this all the time. I don't know, 20 years ago, if you were a newspaper editor, how would you know what your most popular feature was, or who your most popular columnist was. You'd have to run, I guess, a poll, and then you find out it was the crosswords or something. Now we can see, not just my organization, every organization can see in real time how long people are reading an article or listening before they click away, how many people. We have so much granular information, and so then the incentive there is to just is to give the people more of exactly what they want. When people, I think maybe on the left, critics of sort of corporate journalism focus on how it can be bought and paid for, with the advertising process. What about higher ups being uncomfortable with what your message is? It's the exact, that couldn't be further from the situation most journalistic institutions face. They face pressure from the readers and the viewers by far more than anything else, because there's near perfect knowledge about what they want. And I think that can have serious downsides, but look, again, it can have positives, and I think the period of time where there was just a couple institutions that were on their face neutral, but of course they were agenda driven as well, was not necessarily a healthy period. And if institutions have an agenda or an ideology, as long as they're upfront and straightforward about it, and readers know to take that information with a grain of salt and hopefully seek out alternative perspectives as well, that's the best dynamic we can possibly arrive at.
Well, to Amy's point, Robbie, I'm wondering too, the idea that people are coming to places where they are also feeling seen and affirmed, right? The 19th is focused on gender, politics, and policy. We're not talking about women as a special interest group. We're talking about them as half the population and half the electorate. You know what I mean? Like that is something that is appreciated by our readership. Marginalized people, LGBTQ people who are not seeing themselves reflected in national politics are seeing themselves reflected, in stories that we are doing. I'm sure that folks, who are coming to reason are seeing their voices reflected in that coverage. Do you think that also maybe is part of what is bringing people, because they're not seeing their voices necessarily in other outlets nearly enough? And is that part of the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right, there's two ways to do it. You can start your own institution and try to do it that way. You can try to reform an existing institution. Obviously, both paths have some merit.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say no to a nice job at the New York Times out there hiring, but there's a lot of good you can do yourself, I think, just by striking out on your own. And the environment we live in makes that more possible than ever, and that's a good thing, again, about social media.
Yeah, and to your point, the legacy outlets, that doesn't let them off the hook just because you have outlets.
Right. Well, then they feel pressure. They might feel pressure to incorporate some of that perspective into their coverage because they're facing real competition for the first time.
Yeah, I think that's part of the real challenge, is like the positive of the fragmentation and the vast array of sources and options people have, which also allows us to separate. And how do we use that and at some point come back together? I think that's sort of the question.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of concern about this concept of stovepiping, that people are just only go to Reason and that's it, or they only go to the New York Times and that's it, and they're getting a very singular perspective and voice, when in fact, I mean, the internet gives everyone the opportunity to publish.
And also there's a potential for audiences to have a lot of different places to learn from. But that is a choice.
Yeah. And it's a challenge. I mean, there's a lot of good. At the same time, 7 in 10 Democrats say the Republican Party makes them feel angry. 7 in 10 Republicans say that of the Democratic Party. So there is also a lot of just automatic.
Sounds like we found some unity.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a point at which that sort of turning to news to understand the full dynamic gets important, and how is there a way to have some areas of separate consumption and digestion, but a desire to understand as opposed to fuel my way of thinking. And I think that's what you all are, obviously working towards.
And if we avoid romanticizing the past, our present circumstance doesn't seem quite so awful. The media, the journalism industry has had so many issues. There have been time periods of intense misinformation and polarization. I mean, the newspapers started the Spanish-American War based on lies. Your local newspaper used to be called like the Aspen Democrat or the Aspen Republican, right? It's not new that there's ideological capture by journalistic institutions. There was a kind of historically odd period of elite consensus throughout the 90s and aughts that
Kind of
somewhat
I think
disintegrated.
They're in the civil rights
Yes.
movement.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right, and that was a business model,
Yes.
in fact,
Yes.
wasn't it?
Yes.
Amy, how has partisanship changed now that there are actually more places where you can have yourself reflected or your identity reflected? Has it changed? I mean, were we more united when there was less to see? And who's the we in that sentence?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of question, and I can't speak to 3 decades ago, in terms of the data and the trust level there. And I think at that point, if people didn't know to question, there wasn't another option. So if there was frustration, it may not have been voiced at that point. I think one of the questions around, the public says, so if you ask the public about giving equal side, every side equal coverage, the majority there is still saying yes. And even though there's a difference between Republicans and Democrats there, with Republicans a little less likely, it's still majority of both sides. And so I think there's there's a question around what the public really means by that. But when we've done some research that looked over 10 years of data at what were the things that connected most to trust, to news choices, to those types of things, nothing came close to political ideology. And so that, in so many ways today, and what we really saw was after 2016, there was always some difference in sort of trust and in where people were choosing to turn, but nothing like what happened after 2016 when in a number of different measures, it just went like this. And it has stayed that way and gotten wider and wider for the most part.
Well, and Amy, I don't think we can talk about this without talking about the parallel phenomenon of the demise of local journalism, right? I mean, you talked about that data point with people's relationship to journalists, right? I mean, I think that is, there's a direct correlation between that and people's proximity to those journalists, right? Gone are the days when, you had a hometown paper like mine where you had those letters to the editor in your paper where you knew your neighbors, you knew what they were thinking, you knew how they felt because they were writing in, and people were in conversation with each other, and there was a civil discourse that was happening at the community level.
Yeah,
we are losing that when we see the erosion of local newspapers, local news outlets to really facilitate that sense of community.
Yeah, and part of that is economics driven, and part of it is coming under larger sort of corporate ownership, and there's less of a real local journalism there. We have half of the public that's saying now that most of the news, the local news they get, covers things outside the area where they live. And that's their local news. That's not just their news in general. So their local news is really not local in many cases. And the question is there an opportunity there at the local level to, create more of those connections?
Yes.
But to address that, Errin, you appear on MSNBC.
Sure.
Your readers have a better sense of who you are as a person. You're not some kind of just a byline and they don't know who you are. Same with Robbie has a show on YouTube. Does that connect you to people? And do you think that makes them feel like they can trust you and connect with you in different ways now to kind of get over that hurdle a little bit in a trusting sense?
It connects me to a lot of people. It does, absolutely. It's, shout out to the aunties in the airport that are want to take a selfie and thank me for the work that I'm doing. I appreciate that. But no, I mean, look, one of the other amazing things about the 19th is that we are free to republish, free to consume. We are a nonprofit model for that reason. There's no point in covering marginalized communities if they can't afford to read the journalism that we're producing, right? Their voices are in the stories, but if they can't afford it, then what are we really doing here? Also, the free to republish model means that somebody may be reading a 19th story, they may be reading a story that I wrote. Whether they know I wrote it or not is not the point. The point for me is that they are getting that information in the heartland of America where there may not be that local news outlet or there may not be that local reporter who can cover the issue that I'm trying to cover in their part of the country. If they are able to see that and it resonates with them, and they are feeling seen and heard, and they are feeling empowered by that journalism, that is what is important to
and
us.
Robbie, must connect you to people who kind of want that connection to a libertarian sensibility that doesn't exist where they live.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the move has been toward more trust in individual reporters or correspondents or commentators rather than the institutions themselves, and also the economics of where we are right now empowers individual commentators, content creators, media people to strike off on their own if they want. The tremendous growth of Substack is an example. Some of my favorite writers are formerly affiliated with institutions and now are on their own on Substack. We have to remember that probably most people under the age of 25 are getting their news from TikTok, from content creators on TikTok that they trust. That's a dynamic that people are going to have to take stock of. But one thing we try to do, on a shameless plug for my YouTube show, Rising, I represent the kind of right of center libertarian perspective, and I have a left-wing co-host, and we actually have debates and discussions about the topics, which is not something that actually happens very much on cable news anymore. For CNN, MSNBC, Fox, I'm on those channels as well, and usually the host brings on someone who agrees with them. It's something I've noticed. Even the whole bring on a guest to beat up on them and totally cheat because you're the host and you can cut them off whenever you want. Even that kind of, which is not I don't think a good model of journalism, doesn't seem to go on very, very much anymore. And I'm not sure why that is, but we still do that on my show.
But isn't it encouraging? I mean, by modeling that this is something that is possible, right? That discourse is something that can still happen, and that it is a good thing for our democracy, for people of different political ideologies to be able to engage in that way and still walk away friendly.
We have to. We have to.
Errin, that's such a good segue into the other part of the panel title that we all kind of puzzled over, which was whether the news media can help. And I guess my question for you, I'll start with you, should they help?
Well, I thought about this a lot, Dafna, because my initial reaction was, well, is it my job to reunite the country? Well, no, but because I am not responsible for dividing this country. However, certainly the media has played a role in the continued political divisions that we face, and some of the editorial choices that we are making. And there can be editorial choices that maybe don't necessarily unite the country or help with this, but certainly don't make the problem worse. And I think that is something that we should be thinking about as an industry. And again, I think part of the solution to that is bringing in, expanding the voices of the electorate to the extent that we can, to bring in as many people who are feeling unseen and unheard right now across the political spectrum.
Yeah, Robbie, I think you were sort of alluding to the old days of crossfire. Your show sounds a little bit more like ceasefire.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
So
new show title.
Cease-panic. So I asked Errin, should the news media help? I guess my question to you is, could they help?
Yeah, I think they should, and that they could, yes. I have all sorts of pieces of advice I could give to mainstream institutions to rebuild trust, but a very simple one that I think all institutions should take to heart, and I most mean the New York Times and the Washington Post, which have both been guilty of this on a number of occasions, is the kind of story that I have criticized at Reason Magazine over and over and over again, the so-called cancel culture type stuff, a term that is sometimes wielded in bad faith when it's not happening, but the kind of story where in some athlete or celebrity or someone's moment of triumph, you go looking for what they tweeted that was offensive when they were 16, and you write some horrible story about them and how they're the worst person ever. This is a very, very popular story archetype in the mainstream media that should just be zeroed out and not done anymore because there's no point to it, and it's look, we all did and said stupid things when we were teenagers, and there's just got to be, unless it's violent criminal conduct, there's going to be broad forgiveness at this point, because it's going to stick around forever. It's so unfair to young people these days when there's always a smartphone on them, everything they say and do being recorded or transcribed, to hold them to the standard of that's going to be dug up by, and usually it's dug up by other people on the internet, but then it is covered by journalists. Stop covering it, just ignore it. That would, I think that would do a lot of good.
So that's a good answer to the could they. Amy, what does the data say? Would they? Would journalists help if they could?
Well, I think there are two potentially positive takeaways in the data. One is that news is going to stick around, right? People are going to get news, and well, whether it's paid news outlets or nonprofit news outlets, I don't know. But people, that's what happened with social media. None of the original or early social media platforms were designed to have news in them at all. They were designed to be social. News found its way in there because people seek news over the course of the day. They want to find out what's going on. They want to hear what's happening. And so news becomes a very big part, usually, of most of the environments that people are spending time in when it comes to the flow of information. So there's an opportunity for news to have impact. I mean, it does have impact, and there's an opportunity for those that are producing that news to have an impact. And I think the other is in the data we saw in this journalist survey, just crazy levels of passion and love for the job that they're doing. So even as, the first word, the one word that they would use to describe the industry is struggling, is chaos, that they would say the public would use is bias, 77% would do the job all over again. 75% say they enjoy it, it gives them mental satisfaction. So there's a lot of love for the work and the job, and if that core mission is serving the public by delivering them the news, there's potential for connection there.
Yeah, Robbie talked about how we have to let go of the romance of the past, but reporters are in a romance with journalism forever. Yeah. We should let you guys ask some questions. There's some folks with mics, so they can come to you. Why don't we start with this lady in the front with your yellow top? So nice.
I'm matching the mic. It's nice. Anyway, hi, Claire. And I'm wondering we're almost a week into the overturning of Roe, and I'm curious about, maybe this is particularly for you, Errin, but anyone, how do you see journalism and journalists changing or shifting the ways that they are covering the story locally? Like I'm just anticipating, are you thinking through if women are going to be less likely to share their stories, if they're having to find access to reproductive care? Have you been having to think through, since it's such a combative issue, how or if your newsroom balances coverage from the anti-abortion or pro-abortion vantage points? I'm just curious about how is this decision impacting the coverage?
Absolutely, and listen, we know that our audiences are very interested in this story, and because it is existential for a lot of people, and it is something that people feel very strongly about, regardless of what those feelings might be, right? And so, yes, we are considering all of the ways in which a post-Roe reality is going to play out over the next weeks, months, years, beyond, right? And so, I think for us, again, a lot of that is centering the voices of the people who are going to be impacted by and responding to this decision, no matter what their, which side of the issue they fall on. Yes, obviously there are political implications to that. Roe is absolutely on the ballot, I think, for both parties going into the midterms, going into beyond the midterms. And so, yes, there will be some coverage of that we consider, but so much of what we are doing right now is really kind of helping people to understand and navigate what is next and what this means in people's communities, because that is the thing that is very confusing for folks, for everybody, just because, this is happening in real time and so fast, and you are seeing states already, just immediately responding to this decision, had already planned, for this outcome, and are trying to figure out what to do, especially because the federal government maybe is not responding as quickly. And so people are, constantly asking, coming to our website with questions about what this means for them and for their communities.
Yeah, I would say just, I'll kind of jump in there just a little bit on, because Politico published the draft opinion 7 weeks before the actual decision was issued. And that kind of gave the country a 7-week head start for people to mobilize on either end, for political parties to start messaging, and really they didn't. Really they didn't. And I would caution journalists not to jump to enormous conclusions about where they think their story and their reporting is headed. I think we kind of need the public to lead rather than for us to lead. But I think there were some very important lessons that came out of that moment. Yeah. Who else had a question? Go ahead.
Really enjoyed everything you folks have been sharing. Thank you. In the scientific publishing community, a scientist publishes a paper, people try to repeat that research and validate the truthfulness or not. Is there a concept of a truth score or something equivalent that journalists are working towards, whereby, because look, I'm a tech entrepreneur, I get maybe 20 minutes max to read news every day. I'm not gonna research, and I know several of you mentioned that, oh, people don't read multiple sources. I don't even have time to read one source, right? But I think that journalists who are deep in on the topic and are cross-referencing could check each other and have a truth score that they assign to each other, and over time, you build reputation as a journalist around truth. I'm sure this idea has been considered in the past. I'm just curious to know where you think the idea lives today, and how do you look to hopefully take it forward?
Mm-hmm. Robbie and Errin, when you want to talk about how
Sure.
journalism is peer-reviewed?
It is not peer-reviewed. Well, and in some sense, journalists aren't, they're just going to the scientists and asking, well, what do you think? And then, well, are there other scientists who feel differently? Well, here's the range of views. I actually think probably during the COVID crisis, that the genuine disagreement, or the fact that science is a process and a one that's constantly revised when new information comes out, was not always quite filtered down to the level of journalism. There was a lot of, nope, this is the truth. If you disagree with this, you're against the science. But even the scientists don't totally agree. So could that be the case? The kind of fact-checking industry that exists is, in my view, subject to the exact same kinds of ideological capture going on. On Facebook, they deploy independent fact-checking organizations that seem as prone to error, if not more prone to error, than other journalistic institutions. I will say that I think the best fact-checking is often done in a democratic, just let the people decide, collaborative fashion. It's not lost on me, right, that Wikipedia is generally a great source of information because it's constantly being checked by other people, and you don't seem, it seems to me, you don't have the same kind of errors persisting there for long periods of times that you do on Facebook or on Twitter. Twitter is debuting something like that, where instead of the site saying, or some organization saying, no, this is wrong, you just let people say, well, I think this is wrong for this reason, and then people can comment on that, and people can comment on that, and people can comment on that. I think democratic principles at play here can actually be, and we can just let people say what they think about it.
Well, yeah. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, Twitter certainly is fact-checking a lot of people in real time, and that, and a lot of times those folks that are finding errors and misinformation or disinformation are correct. The fact-checking industry is certainly something that has cropped up, probably, I would say, over the last decade or so, if not the last 5 years or so. Those kinds of stories that attempt to correct the record don't necessarily make it around the world in nearly with nearly the same level of effect. I don't think so. People have already heard, the error, and maybe don't circle back to get the correction. But I think the other part, in terms of helping with credibility and establishing news outlets and people who are doing journalism in those outlets as credible, is journalists are increasingly, I think, being expected to talk about how we know what we know, right? Having conversations about how we got a story, the people that, the kinds of people that we talk to, where the story came from and where we went with that story. I think that goes a long way to kind of helping people, if we can talk about the process a little bit more, demystify that for people a little bit more. I do think that that goes a long way to building trust and credibility, if not with organizations, especially with individuals within those organizations that people are supporting.
Yeah, I was going to speak to exactly that, which you know, would use the term transparency, which in addition to connecting with audiences is one of the other things that has been the most critical that the public's looking for, is transparency in how you do your work and in what you don't know. So in so much of our news today, it's evolving. It's where we're reporting things the minute one element happens and we still don't know the next 28 elements that are going to come. So being able to be very open and upfront with the public about what one knows, about what one doesn't know, about the reporting that's still happening, and being able to say, you know, here's a set of clear facts that are events that happen. Here are the things that we think are sort of swarming, and here's the way we're going to approach this story, speaking about how are we going to cover it differently, even if we have the same set of facts. So being able to present the news in a way that helps kind of separate those things for the public goes a long way, both in building trust and helping the public make sense of it. I mean, there is also a lot more onus on the public today to sort through all this stuff and make sense of it, you know, in live reality time as things are developing. But a lot of the fact checking, and there was probably 20 years ago when there was these ideas around a good housekeeping seal of approval for news organizations, so that none of those really took off.
Well, journalists never like to keep anyone from their cocktails. So thank you for staying with us. I know people still have questions. We can stick around, but I think we have to give back the room. But thank you so much, and please help me thank our panel. They were so great.